Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Lean Startup by Eric Ries. And I want to start the summary of this book by talking about a very popular myth that we all have lived with, the idea of this heroic entrepreneur who starts with this one great idea and implements it, starts it in the garage, has this idea and builds a $1 billion company. Maybe it's the $1 billion Facebook or Google or Microsoft or whatever you think. And we all have this fantasy of an idea that they had this one idea that they implemented and just got rich. And it just happened like that. But contrary to all this is the real fact, which is most entrepreneurs, probably 99% of them, they just start where they are with the idea they have. It's usually not a really good idea once it meets the real market, but that's not the point. What they do is once they start and they grow, once they start and they start implementing the idea and test it in the market, they get feedback and they keep on changing and iterating and learning. And that's what the successful ones do. They keep on iterating and learning as the market goes, and hence they get success. They get to success. We have to get out of this idea that a startup is this one great idea and its execution, but we have to start thinking of a startup as one giant experiment. And the key to the startup success is how fast can you learn and how fast can you pivot. And we'll get to the term pivot later on in this as we get into the details of this book, of the summary. The key is to be able to learn very fast about what the market is giving to you and then be able to evolve and change, or as Eric Ries says, be able to pivot to something that is much more meaningful and is going to be a real sustainable product or a solution. And the unit of progress, well, the unit of progress in a startup is not the same as the unit of progress in a established management system. The way you think about units of progress is you do not think of efficiently producing something. You think of how fast are we getting learning, how fast are we validating our learning. That is the key. So having said that, let's jump right into the book, The Lean Startup by Eric Ries. Highly recommend that you get this book. Bar none, one of the best books, one of the best business books that really opened my mind to a lot of the possibilities. This book is Eric has divided this into three pieces. First to explain the vision, then to how you steer, and then how do you accelerate. If you think of in terms of car and a road trip, how you have the vision of where you want to go, and then you steer your car in the right direction, and then you accelerate on to the destination. The key in vision part of the equation is to think of where we start. And if we think of the roots of lean startup, the whole idea is to be able to validate our learning, as we had talked about. And in order to do that, we have to go through this loop of build, measure, and then learn. It's a feedback loop. We build something, we test it out, we measure, and then we learn something from the hypothesis. And depending on what we learn, again, we go back and make the changes and we build something. Now, the key to understand is that even though the build, measure, learn happens in the order of first you build, then you measure, then you learn, the planning for this happens in the exact opposite order, in the sense first you figure out what you want to learn, then you want to figure out how you're going to measure it, and then you figure out, okay, if I want to learn this thing and this is how I'm going to measure it, then what am I going to build in order to do that? That is the way to think about a lean startup. And the big picture of a lean startup is it starts with having a vision, having the big picture idea of what is the true north of the startup, and then having the strategy. A strategy is the model, the roadmap, the ideas about the customer, but these are all subject to change, and a strategy change is what is called a pivot. And then of course it is the product, which is the end result of the strategy. And how often does the product change? Not it is the component that changes the most often. So if the vision doesn't change at all, or it changes very rarely, the strategy changes a little more often, the product is the one that is like the changes in the product or the software or whatever it is, or surface, those are the ones that change all the time, because it's the optimization portion of the whole equation. So having talked about the big picture, let's talk about defining what is a startup. As Eric Ries put it so eloquently, he says a startup is defined to confront situations of extreme uncertainty. And the most tools of general management are not really designed to flourish in such an environment. So the key to a lean startup is the idea of validated learning. That is the most fundamental goal of a startup, to be able to validate its learning. And that is the right way to think about its productivity. To not think about producing something, but to think about how fast we can learn and how fast we can iterate on our learning. And we call it validated learning because we are actually going to put this out in the market, conduct experiments, get results, and get validation on what we are out there to learn. And as we had talked about earlier, we see every startup as one giant experiment, and everything that we do is to validate learning in the early phases of the product design and the early phases of the startup. Now, thinking about experimentation, one of the most important lessons, not only in business but also in life, and probably in all areas of life, it holds true like nothing else, which is if you cannot fail, you cannot learn. If you cannot fail, you cannot learn. If you are out there to learn something new, you have to allow yourself to fail. You have to allow yourself to fail valiantly, to fail in epic proportions, to fail whichever way you need to fail. You have to allow yourself to fail, or otherwise you cannot learn. So now moving on to the next part of the equation, which is steering the whole company, the vision that we have, how to steer into that direction. And the way to think about it is, first of all, to test it. So how do you test? And how do you test fast so that you can learn fast? A minimum viable product is the key answer here. What we want to do as an entrepreneur is to go out and figure out a minimum viable product which will test this hypothesis, which will start the process of learning, which will test out what we're after in terms of learning. And the first product does not need to be perfect. In fact, it should not be perfect, because otherwise we're wasting time. Anything that goes beyond the idea of anything that goes beyond us helping in the learning process is wasting our time. And when we think of quality and design of our minimum viable product, we do not need to go high quality, and we do not need to have any high features. We just need to have the right quality to validate our learning, to learn what we need to learn. And the next step in our steering process after testing is measurement. And this is one of the key ideas in this book, where Rees talks about we don't do just measurement for the sake of measurement. What Lean Startup talks about is the idea of innovation accounting, in the sense you actually account for the innovation that is happening in the company. The changes that you're doing, are they taking effect? Are they making the product better? Are they making the service better? Are they bringing in more money? What changes are causing, what learning and what changes are causing the right things to happen, and what changes are causing the wrong things to happen. So the idea is to account for the innovation that is happening in the company, to be able to understand where the innovation is coming from, what is the good part, what is the good learning that is happening, and to be able to promote that and to take away the other parts. And what Rees talks about here is to use our MVPs to first to use our minimum viable product to get started on the process of measurement, to figure out where we are right now as a company, and then to figure out some measurement statistics, and to continue on with with constant measurement, constant innovative accounting. If you think of a traditional business, we measure in chunks. We measure in terms of overall customer intake versus revenue and profits and all that stuff. What Rees talks about is that every experiment we do, every learning hypothesis we set out to investigate, we must have a cohort. We must have a like a new group of data for that. So that is how we can actually validate the precise learning that we had. So if we start with hypothesis A and do an experiment, and if we start with hypothesis B and do another experiment, and if we start with hypothesis C and do another experiment, we need to have results for each of them separately and be able to understand what happened, what was the outcome for each of them, and hence learn from each of them. And the key is to come up with actionable metrics as a result of these measurements. And after these measurements are done, one of the bigger keys is to be able to say, okay, at this time, shall we pivot or shall we persevere? What pivoting means is to hold one foot firmly on where you are with everything that you have learned and move the other foot around to your new learning. So you know where you were, where you have what all you have learned so far, but then you are able to pivot around to this new learning that you have and say, okay, this is where we need to go now. And as we talked about when we started this summary, we said it's not about the big idea. And that's precisely what Eric is coming to, which is that while 5% of entrepreneurship is a big idea, is that idea, 95% of it is just gritty work. Gritty work in the sense that you pivot and you persevere and you change directions and you change course and you change strategies in order to get to your vision. So now we come to a very exciting part of the book where the idea is, do we pivot or do we persevere? Do we pivot and change course or do we persevere with the direction that we have? And the only way we can get there is through validated learning. Through all the learning that we have done and all the accounting that we have done for that learning, we know, okay, do we need to pivot or do we not need to pivot? Do we need to make a change in course, make a change in direction, or do we need to stay on course? And how many pivots? So the key for a startup and for a startup to survive is to be able to figure out how many pivots it can afford. How many pivots can a startup afford? That is one of the fundamental questions you want to answer for yourself. But even while we're answering that question, what we need to keep in mind is the faster we can pivot, the more time we have to get to takeoff. The runway is the amount of time you have before you run out of money, whether the amount of time in which either you launch or you fail. So starting from where you are to get to the end of the runway, you have to be able to pivot in all the different directions so you can get to the fastest validated learning. So the more pivots you can afford, the faster you can learn, the better your chances of success. And there are so many different kinds of pivots that Ries goes into the book. I highly recommend you get the book for that. But just an overview, there's a zoom in, which is just think of a feature of a product and make it the whole product, or zoom out where what was the whole product becomes a part of a much larger product, and on, customer segment pivot, customer needs pivot, business architecture pivot, value capture, lots of them, amazing pivots. Go get the book. And the other thing we want to talk about is that a pivot is again another hypothesis. As soon as you pivot, you think of it as a new hypothesis that will require a new minimum viable product to again test. So you will again go through that build, measure, learn, feedback loop. Every time you pivot, you're going to go through the build, measure, learn, feedback loop. And the key for a startup is to be able to execute on those as fast as possible, to learn as fast as possible, and as a result, be able to survive. Now let's talk about taking that leap of hypothesis. So every time a startup starts to execute and test, we have to identify which hypothesis we're going to test, because the hypotheses are the ones on which the whole business hinges. So they are leaps of faith assumptions that we've made, and we need to test them. And our whole strategy is usually based on these assumptions. And the goal of a startup should be to test the riskiest assumptions as soon as possible, to build a system, an organization, to be able to test these assumptions as soon as possible. That is the leap of, to be able to test those leaps of faith that we make as entrepreneurs. And now let's talk about the third part of the book, which is accelerating. How do you take, like, now catch momentum and accelerate? So one of the key ideas here is to the batch sizes. If you think of traditional management and traditional manufacturing, you go with large batch sizes, so you minimize your production costs, minimize the efficiency costs, and maximize profits. But what we need to do in a lean startup is to not produce stuff more efficiently, but be able to learn as quickly as possible. And in order to do that, we need to work in small batches in order to validate the learning that we're going through. So even though the loop that we have that we need to go through is to start with a build and measure and then learn, the planning for it starts backwards. So first we say, okay, this is what we need to learn, hence this is what we need to measure, hence this is what we need to build to actually go through this process. So we need to learn to operate in small batches so that we can validate our learning much faster. Now, how do you grow? How do you grow a lean startup? Well, there are various ways in which you can grow, and growth comes from various different ways in a startup today. Word of mouth as a side effect of product use, through funded advertising, or through repeated use, repeat purchase or use. For example, growing to a grocery store. And the three engines for growth are the sticky engine of growth, which is usually word of mouth; the viral engine of growth, in which case a product just transmits through person to person. For example, Facebook, where if one person becomes a member and they want their friend to become a member, now it's a person to person transmission, hence it's a viral effect. And then of course the paid engine of growth, which is through advertising. Now the caveat for a lean startup is to not go and jump into all three engines of growth, but to start and stick with one, and then once it matures to move on to another one. Moving on to adapting, is it possible that a startup can go too fast? Well, yes and no, because there are times when a startup can go too fast because it builds a product that is of such low quality that the learning that was intended could not happen because the product could not be used in the market. So that is the caveat in terms of going too fast. Now, in terms of getting into the problems, to getting to root cause of problems, one of the key methodologies that Ries suggests is using the 5 whys. So let's say you have a problem. You ask, okay, why did that problem happen? And now the answer comes, okay, well, it happens because A happened. And then you say, well, why did A happen? And then the person says, well, because B happened. And then you say, why did B happen? Because C happened. So you ask this question of why 5 times, one after another, until you get to the root cause. Usually after 5 whys, you will have gotten to the root cause of the problem that you're after. So there you have it, the lean startup. Again, as we started talking about the book, the fundamental is to be able to learn very fast. To be able to learn very fast, to be able to pivot very fast, and to be able to shorten our pivot times so we can make as many pivots as possible in order to take off before the runway runs out.